Hey, Fine Homebuilding podcast fans. I have some bad news for those of you who watch the video version of the podcast. We had a problem recording the video on this show, but we thought it was too good to re-record. We've done that in the past, and the second version just isn't as good. So we're really sorry about that, but at least you'll get to see our photos and our listener photos that show what we're talking about.
Flat tape right up against that, but it just makes the job so much cleaner. And then you peel that off. It's almost like peeling the tab off of like a safety cap on like a milk jug or something.
It is so satisfying, that peeling part. Oh my God.
Like
I just like pull it nice and slow. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Kiley Jacques, Design Editor.
Hello.
Rob Wadsack, Digital Brand Manager.
Morning, Patrick.
Morning, Rob. And Jeff Rose, Producer.
Howdy.
You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. You guys would think I'd never done this before.
I don't think I've ever heard you stumble like that before.
This morning has been kind of touch and go for me.
You're excused.
I started getting ready an hour ago, and I still feel like I'm just squeaking by here. Rob, I got to get an update on your pedal-powered lawnmower. How's that coming?
The only real progress I made was I spent like an afternoon with a Sawzall and a grinder cutting off every piece of metal off that tractor chassis that I didn't need. And then I also found a really comfy seat from a recumbent exercise bicycle that I started mocking up on it to make it more pedal friendly.
Where do you find this stuff?
Oh, it finds
Side
me.
of the road.
Actually, yeah, mostly side of the road. No, that bike, I don't know where. I think there was a guy moving out of an apartment across the street from me, and he had all this stuff piled on his lawn, and he's like, "Oh yeah, you want this stuff?"
I think gym equipment is some of the easiest stuff to find on the side of the road.
Oh yeah. But your real effort has been doing some. It seems like rock breaking.
So, Facebook Marketplace is like the best place in the world for me. I find some amazing deals there. I sold like so much stuff on there last year, but I find great stuff there too. And on Wednesday night last week, I was at 10 o'clock looking on there, and I see this picture, free rock wall. And I was like, free rock wall. And I recognized the house as a house around the block from me. I'm like, well, that's convenient. So I texted the person, and they're like, come at 7 a.m. And so I spent like 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. on that last Thursday, moving about 5,000 pounds of rocks in my pickup truck. It took like 4 trips.
That's awesome.
And
how did you not get tick bites?
Well, this is a neighborhood house. Right, that rock wall was actually right on the street, so I was able to just park right next to it.
So did he essentially have you dismantle his rock wall?
So yeah, this woman owns this house, and it's like an older home. I felt bad. I even said to her, I was like, people really appreciate these rock walls around here. She's like, it's in my way. I'm putting up a fence. So anyway, I met some other nice person. There was some younger woman who had a big old beat up Ford truck that took 1 load of rocks, and I took 4 loads. And by the time I was done at 10, there were like, it wasn't even 2/3 of the way through the wall. And
that's cool.
I drove by the next morning, and there was just a tiny little pile of rubble left. And I took that and gave it to my neighbors.
You'd think rocks would be tough to come by in New England.
Yeah.
It would have been fun to do a time-lapse video of watching people take it. Right?
Oh, I know. That would have been great.
I would have made that if it was my house. Of course, I would never give away a rock wall.
You got to tell me about your new lawnmower, Kiley.
Oh, I feel so deluxe. I feel like I've joined the ranks. My weed patch has never looked so good. It's a Ryobi battery, lithium battery electric mower, push mower.
And I bet it is so superior to your real mower.
My grass can't And when I say grass, I mean violets and creeping Charlie. Patch can't grow fast enough. I'm ready to do it every other day.
Are you bagging it?
Yeah, I didn't want to, but the blade won't engage if you don't have the bag on. So,
well, I think it's good for your garden, right? You can use that as part of a compost package.
Yep. Yeah, that was good money spent. I'm glad I did it. I hemmed and hawed about it, you guys know, for about 3 years, and then I finally busted out the cash and got it, and I'm thrilled.
So what did it cost, and did you get another battery?
No, I don't need it. It was still running when I did my property and the lot next door. It was like $350, I think, and I'll have it forever. And
you don't have to buy gas and store it. You don't have to buy gas and store it, and
I love it. Yeah, it's fantastic. And you get to a certain age, and I just felt like the real mower was doing my body more harm than good. So I feel so lazy pushing this thing around, but I work hard in other realms.
I love the idea of a real mower, just like, not noisy, and it's, not using gasoline, spitting fumes out. But if you've ever watched anybody push a real mower on anything but the smoothest piece of property, it's not as easy as you think.
It's really hard. It actually doesn't cut certain species of tall grass, so you wind up with this weird, it just doesn't look as good.
I find it odd you'd say you understand the concept of a real mower, Rob, but you wouldn't want to use one except you're going to put 3 on this pedal tractor that you're building.
Yeah, but then with the pedals, I have a mechanical advantage. I have a mechanical advantage. So
yeah, we'll see. Jeff, I was stunned to see that you were working on a pretty extensive project. I didn't know anything about this, but this morning I was snooping around the podcast assets folder, and I saw a bunch of rot repair photos going on in there. What's that about?
Well, it's one of those 15-minute jobs that spins wildly out of control immediately. And I just decided that, if I'm going to be here working in this office for the duration, I'm going to need a window air conditioner installed because it gets toasty up here.
Yeah.
So I opened the window. It's like, ooh, I should probably paint this windowsill and frame before I put this in. So I started scraping and
it was only paint.
Yeah, pretty much. The paint was holding it together. So
yeah, I have that issue.
And it's the top of the window frame on one side, it's above the deck, so it's about 18 feet up. On the other side, it's above about 28 feet above the ground. So that's complicating things quite a bit.
Heck, yeah. So it looks like you put Bondo in there. It's
the Abtron wood epoxy.
Ooh, you went high end.
Yeah. This is the first time I've used it. So
what'd you think?
It's weird consistency. I mean, the liquid wood was kind of good because we should
tell folks what you're talking about. So this is a 2-part epoxy, and it's kind of like a putty-like consistency.
More like marshmallow.
Before you put that in there, you put this liquid in there to consolidate the wood fibers, right, that are punky.
Right, yeah. So it's just a liquid epoxy followed by, that's exactly what it is. I was trying to think of what that consistency was, and it's like marshmallow fluff.
Yep.
Only it's not sticky.
Yeah.
Which it really needs to be a little more sticky.
Yeah, it is weird because you have to really pack it in there. So it's good to have something with a good hollow and some roughness to it to get that stuff to stay in place. Once it sets, though, it's hard as a rock.
Yeah.
Although the nice thing is that once it sets, it's actually relatively light in weight still, so it's easy to shave with cutting tools back to the shape you need.
What's your experience with this stuff, Rob?
I've used it quite a bit because when I worked for Hudson Valley Preservation years ago, we did a fair amount of rot repair on old houses, especially old windows. And honestly, so for large spaces, I would go to that stuff. For thinner rot repair, I would turn to one of the Bondo type materials, one of the body filler type materials.
Now, why wouldn't you just replace the wood altogether? Just because it's a much bigger project, or because that's what I did at my house. I just replaced it all.
Yeah, part of it is that if you're working on something that's integrated into a wall, it would be a lot of work to tear it apart. Mm-hmm. It's easier to do patches. You could also cut out sections of wood and splice in wood and then cut it back to the same profile as the stuff you're working with. But for a smaller patch, small to medium sized patch, the Bondo type stuff and this epoxy are the two best options. And sometimes it's also because, especially if you're working on an older or historic home, that you want to retain as much of the original fabric of the house as possible.
Mm-hmm. Jeff is replacing a sill under his, at the bottom of his window, which would mean you'd have to tear the whole window out and replace it and try and get it back together without messing something up.
That's what the guy did at my place. I had the same exact issue that Jeff has. But
it's very common with wood windows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially if you have those old aluminum storm windows attached, because those things are supposed to drain, but they don't always. Yeah.
Jeff, who makes your windows? Do you know?
They're Marvin's.
They had a bunch of problems in that era with this wood preservative that was apparently lacking from PPG that they were putting on parts. I think you should file a warranty claim.
How old is that window?
Somewhere in the 18 to 20 years old. Yeah.
So are there other windows going punky? Did you start poking around? Or you probably
there were others I already know about, and that's why I actually had the stuff on hand. It's just this one was kind of a surprise, just because with the window closed, you didn't really see it.
So have you painted it up again? Are you ready to go?
That's probably a project for this weekend, because I've been working on just getting access to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I had a weekend I would describe as puttering. Lots of little projects, kind of fun stuff. I had to fix my riding mower. This was a weird thing that the PTO wouldn't shut off when you turned off the PTO, which seems kind of dangerous to me. And at first I was like, not going to care. I was just like, I won't stick my hand in there when the engine's running, but it's something you can't have going on. So I had to take the deck down, and I discovered that so it has two blades, and they're run by two pulleys on the top of the deck. And there's a pair of a linkage that connects them, so they stop. There's a brake on there that when you put the PTO off, it actuates this brake and stops the blades. Alternatively, when you put it on, it tensions the belt and the blade starts spinning. Well, the rod had separated from one of the pulleys, and it's one of those things that it's just designed to fail, and it just drives me crazy. For another 10 cents, they could have made a much better design that would last longer. So I had to figure that out. I ended up drilling a hole in the rod that connects these two mechanisms and putting a cotter key, in there. And they could have done that at the factory and it would have been great. But stuff is made to be disposable, right?
Well, that's why when I build all those weird things out of machines, I always try to go like 1980s and earlier, because it's not even just the durability of those old machines. It's the fact that everything's accessible on them.
Yeah. I did some other stuff too, but the big news around the house was Carol finished the steps connecting our deck and our patio area, and that's been in a couple years in the works. But I'll put some photographs up on the podcast page so folks can check that out. But her masonry skills are top notch. I got to say, I got to find another project for her to do.
Well, I got a big pile of rocks if she wants to practice building walls in my place.
One thing I've observed about people who get into stone masonry is they never stop. They just keep building stuff. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. I've got a wall in mind myself. I'm a big fan of the stonework.
So you're going to steal rocks out of the river?
I don't have enough rocks. Yeah. I wish I'd known about that wall coming down, although I don't have a truck either. But I have a big wall to build, or a long wall. It's not going to be very tall, but.
You can move those in your Fiesta.
Yeah, I can do everything in my Fiesta. Just
take a few trips. Yeah. Well, so Kiley, one just comment on that. It's like, you and Matt had that sort of face off about decks versus patios. And it's like, I built my patio 16 years ago at my house. It looks the same as the day I built it, and I've never had to do a thing to it. And that's what I love about stone. Yeah,
there's that. Let's not go there. You know how I feel.
Oh my God. We got some great feedback this week regarding last week's show. This is from Ken in New Hampshire. Just finished watching podcast 251. And while all that siding talk was stimulating, it was the sauna talk that really caught my attention. I agree with Kiley that the health benefits of heat, relaxation, endorphins, improved circulation are clear, but I wanted to know if the many of us actually prefer a steam bath instead of the dry heat of a sauna. Outside of Boston and Chelsea is Dylan's Russian steam bath, tucked away under the Tobin Bridge, where since 1885 you can sit in a traditional Russian banya and sweat like a... It rhymes with bastard. The clientele is also a draw. One time I had the Harvard-educated Mass State Senate president on one side of me and a bricklayer on the other. The best part is you can get a traditional plates massage, which is best described as a beating with a hot soapy broom made of oak leaves while lying on a bench face down in the steam room. To keep from overheating, you wear a white canvas sailor's cap that has been dipped in ice water. The experience feels comparable to being strapped to the roof of an SUV, naked and driven through an old school car wash, not the touchless variety, while the hot water is turned up too. I'm not kidding, by the way. Do try this if you're ever near Boston. It is men only except for Monday nights, which is ladies' night. It is a real treat. I've become a podcast addict and look forward to every Friday, so I hope you guys are enjoying the work. It seems so. Best wishes, Ken. What do you guys think? That sounds horrible to me.
Man, he sure paints a picture, doesn't he? I felt like it reminded me of one of my favorite books, Dandy in the Underworld. I just feel like he really he put us right there.
So I looked the place up, and they're doing like some sort of social distancing stuff, but they're still open for business. So we want to drive up there. It's only a couple hours away back there. And you know what? There are photos of lots of the guys there in their little white sailors hats and their towels, and they all had big smiles on their faces. So there must be something good about it.
I love it.
I love that stuff can survive, you know, for so long. That's really quite cool. You know, that was, you know, for originally Russian immigrants, right? Or folks who had come from the old country and somehow
part of their culture
stayed around. That's really cool.
It is cool.
Had you guys heard about this at all?
No.
Yeah, neither.
No.
You know, so the other thing we heard about, and it was in greater volume than anything since our over-trucked discussions. So it was Kiley's septic system, and this really seemed to capture people's imagination. So
yeah,
this is from Eric. He says, I heard your most recent podcast this morning. Here is some research on septic tank additives. This is one I give to my clients. It is from North Carolina State University. Short version, they aren't worth the money, and they do little to nothing. The risk is that they harm your drain field. Try talking with soil scientists who research these products. That would make a nice discussion. They won't have much good to say about them. Big state institutions for septic and soil science are NCSU, WVU, and Purdue. There are others. Love the show, Eric. I've heard the same thing, and I'll admit to having a strange fascination with this subject, and I've read a bunch of issues of Small Flows Quarterly, which used to be published by West Virginia University, which is, he says, is one of the big researchers in this, and its stuff is pretty fascinating, I got to say. Mm-hmm. If anyone knows the soil scientists or septicologists or whatever you call it in your state who would be willing to be on the show, especially on the Pro Talk version, I would love to talk to them.
That's a great idea.
I think that would be super interesting.
Well, I looked up the NC State department there, and they have one of the most comprehensive descriptions of a septic system and how it works that I've ever seen. So I'll put a link to that on the podcast.
What people don't understand is, you know, basic human sanitation has probably done more to improve the human condition than anything we've done. And, you know, on-site septic systems are very much a part of that. You know, it used to be that everyone's septic ran into the local, you know, stream or watershed and spoiled everything, but we've really made great strides.
I will say the guy that poured all of the cess flow down my pipe made me come over and take a look at the bubble action. I think he wanted me to feel like I was getting my money's worth. See?
I think he should have like tossed a smoke bomb in there too, just to like, look at this.
So I've got the sewer treatment plant for our whole town at the end of my street. It's only about a block away, and they just rebuilt it a few years ago, so it's actually a lot less stinky than it used to be. But I had talked to one of the guys there, and my daughter reminded me of this recently, that they were like willing to give us a tour because we were kind of fascinated to see how the
you
whole
should
thing
totally
works.
do it, Rob.
Yeah.
You should totally do it. So in the fourth grade, our fourth grade teacher took us to the sewage treatment plant for the town that we lived in. And it was fascinating, especially when you're like, 10 years old, right?
Is that what happened to you?
Oh my God. So should we take some questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Our first one comes from William. He says, our house was built with ridge and gable end vents. Recently, we had an unusually strong windstorm. The wind was coming directly at the north end of the house. After it subsided, I was leaving to go to the store when I noticed an issue with the roof. The north first section of ridge vent was off the ridge and laying on the roof upside down. The south end ridge vent was blown up and almost off. My thinking was that the wind blew in the north gable vent and it didn't have enough exit points, so it blew the ridge vent off. When my neighbor, an ex-roofer, later went up to check on it and fix it, he wasn't happy. He said that there were more than enough nails holding the 3-tab sections of the shingles, but only a few longer ones were holding the vent to the sheathing. He promptly repaired the issue, and even with a heavy wind, it has been fine. So do we have a issue of poor craftsmanship and a sloppy job? Now to go even a step further, I think I should close off the gable vents. There is a different reason than what was mentioned in your attic venting articles. What is your opinion? Okay, so he wants to know if he should close off the gable end vents to prevent his ridge vent from blowing off again. Anyone want to weigh in on this yet?
If you do look at a lot of the articles, you will get kind of mixed stories about whether or not you should have gable vents and ridge vents. And sort of the simple answer is if you go inside and your roof's been around for a long time and you got no problems in there, that if someone has added a ridge vent over the years, that the gable vents probably aren't harming the roof at all. And I think it was probably more a craftsmanship and fastening issue than anything else. But that's just my assessment.
It's a good question. And I emailed William and got some more detail. There's some photos. I don't know if you guys saw it in the assets folder this morning, but he sent me some photos last night that I put in there. But he's got a pretty low slope single-story home. And I think what you suggest, Rob, is totally accurate. It's just the guy who put that on didn't nail it well enough. And the reasons for that are many. It's because most ridge vents need longer nails than the roofer has in his tool belt. And the other thing is, it's that you want to get that thing done so you can get the heck off the roof and take your check as quickly as possible, right? You want to just get this thing done and go home. And I know in the Dade County area, you're not allowed to have ridge vents because they do tend to blow off in high wind events. So I think that's your answer. I think your neighbor fixing it was the best possible outcome because purely as a source of pride, he's going to be checking to see that ridge vent is in place after every wind event for all of history, for as long as he lives. So that's the guy you want to do that.
And you made a good point there, Patrick, is that in certain parts of the country where they do have high wind on a regular basis, the ridge vent, even in the best conditions, is not a great idea. And so, certainly if you were adding a new ridge vent or redoing your roof as opposed to fixing something that had been there for years, the best thing to do is to look at the local regulations and the guidelines for ideal venting situations.
What did you just say? Regulations? What?
We got to talk about the code.
I was telling William that the science, and you guys have heard me say this, listeners and you guys alike, I'm sure, is that the research that codified roof venting is very spotty at best, right? This is stuff that comes from the 30s and early 40s. And, I question whether ridge vents do anything. On most roofs, you have to have enough slope and enough, you can't have a hip roof, you can't have hips, you can't have valleys. All these things prevent the flow of air from the soffits up to the ridge. So, most roofs aren't designed for good, venting. So
seems like the Cape style roof is the ultimate, right?
Except then you have problems with conditioning your second story, right?
Insulating the ceiling in your
kitchen.
I mean, really a ranch house is the simplest house to vent with a typical gable roof. But like you were saying, the science behind it, the most recent research done by some of the building science consultants over the past, couple of decades, is that you need huge amounts of soffit venting and less ridge venting in order for it to be effective at all.
And most roofs don't have enough pitch. Like you really need 8, 10, 12 pitches to work effectively to get that convective action going. Yeah, so I don't know what to say about ridge vents other than your building inspector is going to make you do it, whether it works or not. All right, our next question comes from Scott in Ann Arbor, Michigan. As a longtime listener of the Fine Kumiko podcast, I just recently started listening to the Fine Air Sealing podcast, and I am hooked. Do you know what he's talking about, Rob?
I don't catch the first reference there. No.
That's the Fine Woodworking podcast.
That's the Fine Woodworking. Kumiko are these little Japanese style panels that are all vacant over there.
Yeah, Matt Kenny posts pictures of them all the time. Yeah, right.
and Mike Pekovich is on his own Kumiko kick. So there you go. I know you've probably talked about much of all this before, but I figured I'd see if my situation would make for a compelling podcast content. I would be doing all the labor myself, and I feel confident I can do a good job. We're not talking hand-cut dovetails. Am I right? My 2-story colonial house has poor air sealing and insulation attributes typical of its 1967 vintage. I'd love to vacuum up the attic insulation and replace the whole house fan with a drop-down staircase, air seal the rafter vents, add some electrical, and blow in the appropriate amount of insulation for my region, which is R60. Problem is, I already have about 12 inches of loose fill fiberglass up there. It's 1,100 square feet of attic floor, making air sealing difficult. Here's my questions. Can you imagine climbing around 1,200 square feet of blown-in fiberglass to seal the holes in your attic? That sounds horrible.
No, especially if you look at the pitch of his roof, there's got to be not a whole lot of space up there.
Oh, my gosh. It looks like a dreadful job.
Yeah.
He says contractor removal of the insulation is $2,200 to $2,750 in my area. And that's a deal breaker. I can rent a vacuum removal vacuum in bags for $500 to $600. Is this a fool's errand or something a capable pig-headed DIY wire could take on? That's a lot of insulation to throw away, about $600 worth by my calculations. Can it be blown back into the attic once the work is done? Cellulose seems way cheaper, about 35% less. If I can reblow the old fiberglass, can I do cellulose first or vice versa? Any problem with using the two different insulation materials? I'm certain the walls in the house leak like a sieve. It has 2x4 walls with R7 blown, with R7 fiberglass and brown fiber sheathing like Celotex. Are there any practical strategies in how or low-hanging fruit for improving the air sealing of the walls? Major retrofitting of the interior walls or exterior sheathing and new exterior sheathing and siding is not in the cards right now. All right, so can you suck up your own fiberglass insulation, and can you then reuse it by yourself, or can you reuse it?
Oh man, I mean, I guess it's not. I guess it's physically possible, but it doesn't seem practical. I'm not sure. I mean,
what's the not practical part, Rob?
Well, first of all, where the heck are you going to put all that stuff, and how are you going to vacuum it out of there in an effective way?
And then blow it back in.
The insulation trade has these collection vacuums designed for this very purpose. Mm-hmm. It's got a very powerful vacuum and probably a 6 or 8 inch nozzle that, a guy just stands up there and walks around and sucks it all up, and then the material goes into these big collection bags that all I've known is people just throw them away when they're done. So,
but then can you use that same bag as a distribution sack to then put it back? Like I would have to transfer all of it to some other container, right? And
then you have to feed it back in the hopper of the insulation blower. And I would say that if you can rent the machine, that's fine. But nobody's going to let you do that because the chances of nails or some other contamination screwing up the machine are too great. It's not worth the $600 in savings for an insulation contractor, I'm sure, because the machine is worth thousands, right? So they're going to throw this away and buy new insulation because they don't want the stuff to jam up or break their machine.
Also, wouldn't you assume that the insulation itself is degraded over time and is probably not something you want to reuse?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, if it's a leaky attic, it might be a bit dirty, but there's nothing actually wrong with the fiberglass itself. I mean, a lot of people worry about insulation, fibrous insulation settling, but the R value per inch actually increases if as it gets compacted. So, so it's not a problem necessarily. I mean, some people will tell you that you shouldn't be blowing cellulose over fiberglass, or you shouldn't be, reusing old insulation like that. But if you go onto the GBA forum, there's plenty of experienced people who deal with insulation on a regular basis that say that it's no big deal to leave old fiberglass in place and blow cellulose right over the top of it. But that doesn't give him the ability to do his air sealing at the ceiling.
So I pressed Scott for details about his house, and I asked him about his energy bills and the comfort of the house. He told me that he can't get the house comfortable in really hot weather. Even if they're running the air conditioner full blast, he can't get it below 75 degrees, which is probably somewhat okay. But my guess is that ceiling is just radiating heat in the hot weather because it's going to be the attic temperature. Mm-hmm. So I think the need is probably demonstrable that he needs to do some air sealing, and I don't see how he can do it with the fiberglass there. It needs to go. The one thing I was worried about is he's got a pretty low slope roof, and he wants to put R60 in there. And a point I would make is that the insulation layer in your attic, the thermal boundary, can only be as good as its most shallow part. So there's no way he's going to get as much insulation along the eaves as he is in the center of the roof. So, you're no matter how much insulation you put in the center, it's only going to be as good as the 12 or 14 inches you have around the perimeter. So, you could overdo this. I would say it would be much more important to get the, ceiling diaphragm sealed up. And if you have ductwork up in the attic for your cooling system, and I didn't ask him that, I wish I would have, do what you can to get that ductwork sealed or out of the attic even better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that he could do, if you're talking about adding more insulation, is he could build rigid foam baffles and put them between the rafters on the edges, and that will give him more R value per inch in that narrow space. And if he does it well, it'll also be a better job of air sealing and preventing potential air leakage up into that part of the roof. I mean, that low slope roof, I don't know how the heck you would get up in there into all the shallow edges to do a good job of air sealing. I mean, I would probably be more tempted to just focus on the stuff that I can get from down below, like that big giant hatch, that fan hatch that he has. I mean, those things can't be contributing to his comfort very well. If it's
I think Scott gets it, right? He's talking about doing all the right things, right?
Yeah.
And getting rid of that attic fan would be a huge step. He tells me he has to jam fiberglass bats in it in the wintertime. And
how does he get him? Yeah, it sounds awful to do that every year.
And it's not very effective, right? It's going to help some, but if he could get that out of there, that would be awesome.
Yep.
What about to his point of doing it himself? Is this something you guys would do? I definitely wouldn't.
That's something I've already done for the most part in my house.
What, remove all that kind of fiberglass?
Yeah, my back attic is all unfinished, and it had a cruddy layer of fiberglass in it, and I removed all of that. And
it had bats though, right, Rob?
Yeah, bats is different.
It did, but they were just like disintegrated into, it was a mess back there.
It's the most foul work I've ever done, I got to say, especially this time of year. You're sweating and the fiberglass fibers stick to your skin. It's freaking just terrible.
Yeah, it took me years to do it because I would only do it in the shoulder months because you don't want to be freezing or baking up there,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's totally within the realm of hardcore DIYer. The work is not hard technically, but it's just horrible. It is probably a good bang for your buck because someone's going to charge you to do this awful work, right?
Yeah. And again, an unfinished attic in a ranch house is like the biggest low-hanging fruit you can find because you can pack it full of insulation. You're not worried about it's just a big empty space it's best filled with insulation.
I also asked Scott if he had a wet basement because, when you have a wet basement and air leaks into the attic, you can often have very serious sheathing damage from that warm, moist air condensing on the attic sheathing during the winter. Is that convection is it's carrying the moisture up constantly and it's getting up there and it doesn't have a chance to dry in the cold temperatures. So And he's in Ann Arbor, right? Like, so it's cold there.
And another good point is we should mention this anytime anybody does major air sealing on an older house, is that you always have to address the moisture issues in the basement first, because, and I know that from experience, because once I started tightening up my house, my damp stone basement became damper and damper with every modification to the house that I did. So you have to address any moisture issues first.
This was a point brought to home by Peter Yost on the Pro Talk podcast. We did it with him. And he's like, if you're going to improve your thermal layer, you better do your moisture management in equal parts or more, because all of a sudden those things get to be way more important when you don't have the drying of open stud cavities and, the back of your sheathing exposed. The same holds true for roofs, I'm sure. All right, this next question comes from John in Cornelius, Oregon. Did I say that right, Kiley, Oregon?
Yeah, I think it can go either way on that one.
You can almost do it in 2 syllables instead of 3, though, right? It's like
let's hear it.
There's some flexibility.
John says, I've been subscribing to FHB for many years and only recently found out about the podcast. I've now listened to a bunch of them and really enjoy the information. I'm a DIYer with a fair amount of personal construction history and an electrical software engineer by trade. My question is this. I'm building a wall to provide a proper handrail on an open staircase in my shop building. The stairs lead to a work-from-home office built into the trusses. So he has attic trusses. And if you guys have ever seen these, it's like a big typical triangle shape, but except on the middle, it's got a square cutout that you can make a room in there, right? Does that make sense? Would I explain that adequately?
I think so.
When the shop was built, I hired a contractor to do the sheetrocking and texturing. He used a round corner bead to build the stairway wall. I had to strip away a bunch of it so the wall could be attached to the outside of the stair stringers, which had been covered with drywall. The new drywall will need to cover the new wall and wrap under the same to join the existing sheetrock. My issue is that the mud was applied really thickly, at least 1/8 inch where I pulled the rounded bead off. I'm trying to figure out how to build a nice looking edge profile without adding to the thickness of the mud coat. Dragging the taping knife across the orange peel texture is going to make a mess. Yes, it will. To make matters worse, all of the walls are painted. I really like to avoid pulling the sheetrock back any further. The idea of grinding, sanding the was that you, Ron?
Yeah, the train's coming by.
The idea of grinding, sanding the texture back crossed my mind, but seemed like a good way to make a lot of dust. Also make your life miserable. I'm planning on doing the sheetrock and texturing myself for this little job. This must happen quite a bit in the field as rounded edge molding seems to create a 1/8 inch ridge at the corners to blend into the radius. Any addition to an existing wall would run into the same problem. Well, you run into this no matter what kind of corner bead you have, because the mud coat is always built up to hide it, right? And I had to deal with this in Liam's bedroom closet recently, because it actually had inside corners that formed the closet walls that we took down. And then I had to patch the 2x4 where the wall was. And so you end up with this big hump because there was a buildup of mud on both sides. And that's just the way it is. I happen to have a great solution to your problem, John. And it is called a Tearaway flat bead. So I'm going to do my best to describe this. It's a plastic bead with a flange on it that you mud over, and then there's a little projection that you mud up to. On top of this projection is a piece of plastic, and it's creased in such a way that when you're done all taping, you peel this off. And what that allows you to do is you put this up to the textured ceiling, and then you can mud up to it. And it doesn't interfere with the textured coating. It gives you a ridge to stop at. It's a transition point. And more commonly, this is used in situations like where you're drywalling or plastering up to, say, a timber frame or a masonry decoration like a fireplace hearth or a chimney, right? And this will gives you a place to stop the drywall with a nice clean edge. And then when you're all done taping and finishing it, you can pull this piece of plastic off and it looks like $1 million. I use a ton of it in my barn because the sheetrock runs up to the posts that form the structure of the building. Have you ever seen this, guys?
Oh yeah, it's a dream to work with, because at any time where you're trying to not make a mess against another surface, I mean, even sometimes against old window trim in a house, like you'd think like, oh, well, I can just flat tape right up against that, but it just makes the job so much cleaner. And then you peel that off. It's almost like peeling the tab off of like a safety cap on like a milk jug or something.
It is so satisfying, that peeling part. Oh my God.
Like
I just like pull it nice and slow. It is a fantastic product. You used to have to really monkey around with different ways to make this work. But now this is the solution. And you can either staple this product to the drywall. My favorite way is actually to use a spray applied adhesive, because the solvent smells so delicious. I don't know what's in that stuff, but I'm sure it's toxic. But the other thing you could do, I thought of, was to just make the wall thicker that goes up against the stair stringer, right? So he made this like 2.5 or 4, 3.5 inches wide. You could have just made it deeper so it went up to the old ceiling transition, and then you just start fresh from there. But you're just going to love using the peel away bead. I would just want an excuse to use that for some reason and peel off that plastic tab.
Yeah, but your last comment, Patrick, is a good point. It's like if you're dealing with an unconventional aesthetic detail, I find a lot of times it's just best to find come up with a creative trim detail or something like that looks intentional, that can hide. I mean, that really, in old houses, a lot of times that's the purpose of trim, is to hide awkward transitions.
Mm.
Yeah, and he could do like a crown molding at the top of his wall that lapped onto the textured ceiling. Does the crown molding look right in a garage shop? Probably not. But, I mean, I think this is a design problem or a peel away bead problem to solve. His shop is lovely, I might add.
Yeah.
Okay, so Nick writes in, Dear FHB podcast, I'm a longtime listener of the show and have thought of writing in many times. I often think of a great question for you, but only when I'm swimming in insulation or tangled in Romex. This time I've planned ahead. The people who write into this show are pretty freaking good writers.
Agreed.
It's awesome. I live in a 1908 bungalow in Portland, Oregon. Did I say that right? Oregon?
No.
Oregon's better.
I'm in the process of converting the basement into living space with the addition of 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living area, a kitchen, and a separate entrance. This space will be used as a short-term rental and an in-law suite. My question is about soundproofing. My God, we've gotten this question a lot lately, right?
Yeah.
I think people are at home so much more, and they're like, hey, you people are making a ton of noise. Shut the heck up.
Totally.
The main floor is framed with 2x8s, continuous 28-foot boards, which I think is cool, and is original 3/4-inch tongue and groove fir flooring attached directly to the joist. So this has 28-foot 2x8s. Is that awesome or what?
Cool.
So when I worked in the lumber yard, we prided ourselves on having the longest framing lumber around, and we had 20-foot and 24-foot 2x8s, 10s, and 12s, and I thought that was remarkable. But
can you even carry one of those boards by yourself?
It's pretty
Seems
hard.
like it'd be wonky.
It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
But if you're doing, a stick framed roof in Vermont, it's got to be pretty steep because of the snow load, right? You need pieces of lumber that are this long. Is that Heathcliff?
It's Heathcliff.
We haven't heard from him in a long time. Does he have a question? Does he have a podcast question? He hates the podcast.
He's locked away.
He says, the flooring has been refinished a few times as it's pretty thin. There have been various patches over the past 100+ years. There are sections without tongues, and there are some loose and maybe broken tongues. The result is a very creaky floor. I like the look, but I'm concerned about the noise because it'll be bothersome for anyone staying in the basement. So far, I've removed the furnace and ducts from the basement and patched the register holes in the flooring. I have foam plumbing and electrical penetrations. I plan to fill the bays with rock wool bats and install a resilient channel to isolate the drywall from the framing. Before I close off the bays, I'd like to do what I can to reduce creakiness. Much of the creaks seem to come from the unsupported sections between the floor joists. Some thoughts. Maybe I could foam the underside of the floor to add rigidity. I could put caulk or construction adhesive at connections, try some elaborate system of blocking and shims, or install nude hardwood flooring over the top. I'd rather not spend the time and money to cover the floor, as I do like the original floor look, and it would be a real pain to rework the original trim on the main floor. The floor is surprisingly level. If I did go the route, I think it would take to it well. However, I grew up in a 1790s house in southern Vermont, so my reference point for level might be a bit skewed. I appreciate any ideas or input from the brain trust. Keep at it. So I thought the way I want to attack this question is, let's start first. Do we leave the fir floor as it is? Or do we put a new floor over top of that?
Leave it as it is. Adding a floor to it isn't necessarily going to solve anything.
We never agree on anything. And this is definitely something we agree on, right? You got to leave that beautiful fir floor because it's historic to the house. It's appropriate to the area. And it's just cool.
Yep. And he loves it. So
Heathcliff agrees.
I'm sure he would.
Yeah. I think you just got to leave it alone. All right, what about spray foaming the bottom?
That's certainly not the first thing I would do, and there's even sort of different opinions on whether that's an ideal material to use for a situation like this. I don't think it would really do a whole lot. But I mean,
why do you think there's some debate on whether this is the right material, Rob?
Because we talked about this before, about how density is really one of the big things about materials that you put for soundproofing, and there's a lot better materials I think you could go with other than spray foam. And people think that just by locking it in with foam and filling the space that they're solving the problem. And I mean, I'm sure it does to some extent, but it's certainly not the most economical solution.
It's also not really the purpose of spray foam. I mean, that's right.
That's right. But it is a fantastic adhesive, as anyone who's gotten it on their skin will tell you. It doesn't come off without a fight. I think it would probably help to lock the loose flooring in place, but it's also going to be very expensive. I believe that spray foam is about $4 a board foot. So you can do the math. It's going to cost a ton of money.
What about his shimming and blocking idea? It seemed like the right thing to me, but I have no,
I think you're right, Kiley. And I think you'll find that there are a few spots that are really bad, and if you could attack those with some like plywood patches on the underside that you secure there with either pocket screws into the joist, or put little cleats under the plywood and maybe some spray foam on top of that and make like a little patchy sandwich to fix the worst parts. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think his list up to the point where he talked about flooring and spray foam was pretty good. I think he's on the right track. And I think what I would probably do is, like you pointed out, Patrick, is that it's probably a handful of worst offending places. I would go downstairs, have somebody walk around upstairs and try to identify the worst spots, use a combination of either shimming, blocking, construction adhesive, and plywood, on the underside. We even had a reader tip way back in issue 86 where some guy took like a biscuit joiner and he like ran down the seams of his tongue and groove subfloor and biscuited and glued the things together. But
from the underside.
Well, he did it from the top side because it was just a subfloor for him. But we could do this from the underside. I'm not saying I'm recommending that as the first choice, but there's a lot of different ways you can lock together old tongue and groove boards. And I think I would think a combination of shimming, blocking, construction adhesive, and patches of plywood is probably the best route.
Don't we have an article on this? I feel like we've
got several, and I've linked to them in the notes. So
I should probably read our magazine. I don't remember any articles about this.
I know I've come across it.
Well, being on the website all the time and trying to share our content all the time, I kind of run across all kinds of.
There's a product, and I regret I didn't do my homework before the show, but it just dawned on me. It's this fixture and this kind of screw, and you use this fixture to break off the screws that are driven below the surface. And this is a common thing. It's not a common thing, but it's a way to fix squeaky hardwood flooring, and I'm sure it would work on his softwood flooring as well. But this fixture allows you to drill screws through the top side of the flooring into the framing, and then this little fixture snaps off the screw just below the surface so you don't see it. And you can actually run these things through carpeting too, and it's kind of a cool product. I'll do my research and put that on the podcast page because the name escapes me, and it's a useful thing, and it might be perfect for this situation.
So you're saying that you would screw it down, the fastener would leave a tiny little hole, and you'd fill that maybe with some wax filler or something like that?
Or you just leave the hole and call it character, right? I mean, if it were me, I would try to avoid a pattern that was obvious because then your eye will pick it up. But I think if you spread them around or kept them random somewhat, it would be very easy to hide with filler or whatever.
Yep.
I also, I want to point out that Nick has already done all the low-hanging fruit. He's filled all the penetrations that connect the levels. He's going to put the rock wool in the joist cavities, which is a good sound deadening material. He's going to use resilient channel on the bottom side of the joist for his new drywall ceiling, and that's going to help with the sound an awful lot. So you might discover, that the squeaks aren't even a problem. I would do as much as I could before you put this drywall ceiling up, of course, but you're doing all the right things. And
I like that he's concerned about occupants downstairs.
Well, he's trying to make a bunch of money doing Airbnb here, so he doesn't want to have.
Right. But some people don't give that a lot of thought, and it can make or break an experience.
Have you guys ever had basement apartments?
No. I lived in a house that had a basement apartment, but I wasn't down there.
I lived in a couple of them.
What was your experience, Jeff? Was it noisy upstairs?
Not usually, no. But I think that was more about who lived upstairs than...
Totally.
How was the rest of the apartment experience in the basement otherwise?
The first one I lived in was kind of minimalist and kind of a dampish basement, so it complicated things. But the second one was really nice because it was a raised ranch, so it was, ground level, basically.
You had windows.
Yeah. I had to walk out and...
My good buddy in college, his parents bought a fixer-upper house in the town where our college was as an investment, and they were going to let him rent it, and he would charge them the same, or they would charge him the same rent that he would have paid somewhere else, and they're keeping the money in the family. And he agreed to let my buddy and I live in the basement if we could convert it into habitable space. And that sounded for free. So that it sounded very appealing when he made the call to me, right? And I'm like, well, heck yeah, I'll do that. I don't mind living in a basement. So we get over there, and it's like got a 6-foot ceiling, and there's steam pipes hanging down another 8 inches. And I was walking around the space that had, the porcelain bulb holders with the chain and stuff. And I'm walking over to turn on one of these lights, and I smack my head right on this steel pipe. And I was like, no, Jim, I think I'm going to pass. I was
amazing.
No amount of free is worth this.
Right. Constant concussions.
Yeah.
It's amazing the difference in prices. When I lived in Seattle, I had some friends that lived in basement apartments, $1,000 less to live down there than on the first floor even,
It's really common in New York, right? I mean, they call them garden apartments because I bet that looks better in a real estate listing than basement. But it all depends on how much pressure you have on your housing stock. If people are willing to do that, and what you can charge for it, of course.
So Patrick, while you were talking, I quickly looked up. Those things are called counter snap screws. Those floor repair screws, and they come with a special little tool that you just use to knock off the head of the screw, and it breaks off below the surface. So it actually, when you run the screw through that fixture, Rob, which kind of looks like a little stand, right? It's like got legs on it and a top. Yep.
And when you drive the screw in, the head makes contact with that, and that's what shears off the screw down below the surface. So it's really easy, and they're not expensive, right? You see the price there?
No, let's see. Yeah, like $10 a box. For I don't know how many that is, maybe 50 screws or something like that.
What is that called again?
Counter snap.
All right, so there you go, Nick. There's your solution. Buy a podcast shirt, all right? So I was talking about, I was it 2 weeks ago, podcast shirts. I don't know if anyone's bought or even heard that episode yet, but I was going to wear mine today, but my mom sent me a package yesterday and I had no idea what it was. And honestly, the mail right now kind of freaks me out, but I was sure it was something good. So I got my Clorox wipes out and wiped out the package. And here's what she sent me.
Whoa.
She knows you.
So I had to wear that today instead of our podcast shirt. But I want to remind all of you that the Teespring has a number of Taunton merch products available, and they're pretty freaking cool. And so I bought one. I hope you all do too. Do you guys want to talk about sawhorses for a minute? So I got a text or an email from Justin the other day, and he wants me to do a feature on sawhorses for our next issue. And it was decided, well, it wasn't decided. We weren't sure if we were going to do like homemade designs or commercially available products. So I would love all of you listening to weigh in on what you use with regard to sawhorses, both manufactured versions and homemade ones. These features, we've done it several times in the past 4 decades that the magazine's been around. Has it been 4 decades, Rob?
Something like that, yeah.
Anyway, and they're very popular because you learn stuff. Even if you've been a tradesperson for decades, seeing someone else's sawhorse designs often sparks your own imagination. So those of you listening, if you'd be willing to share what kind of sawhorses you like, I would be super grateful. So I'm going to ask you guys what you like to use, and then I'll go and maybe that'll spark some interest from our listeners. Who wants to go first?
I left my sawhorse those sawhorses that I made at my carpentry workshop. They're at Maria's barn still.
She's probably cursing you daily, moving those things around, right? She's like, "What the heck, Kiley? Get these out of here."
I enjoyed making them, but I don't have a place to put them really. But
so, can you briefly?
They're pretty basic.
Yeah, can you explain the design, Kiley?
I don't know that I can. I don't. It's a sawhorse.
What was it made out of? How heavy was it? How thick was it?
2x4s, and there was a like plywood gusset, and they're super basic. I sent you guys a photograph of them, right?
Did you? What tools did you use, Kiley? Was it only a circular saw to cut them? Did you use a hand saw? How did you cut the parts?
Both. Yeah, we used both. Not much with the hand saw, but yeah, and impact driver. It was all very basic stuff. They're heavy and they take up a lot of room, so that's why I didn't take them with me.
How about you, Jeff? What do you fancy sawhorse wise?
I've got basically 2 different styles. I've got the cheap folding plastic ones that I pretty much use for material holding, just piles of wood or whatever, and then I've got some that are made from 2x4s with plastic collar that you attach with a wing nut. So you can disassemble them pretty readily.
And so those are pretty sturdy compared to the similar design with the metal kind of connector, right? Like the plastic ones work way better.
Yeah. And I've had them for a long, long time. So.
And the plastic folding ones you have, do you know the brand, Jeff?
I've got one that's probably a Stanley, and then I think I got a couple of them from Lowe's or Home Depot, with store, I think Workforce or something like that, they were on sale, so I just grabbed them for.
And do you use the different styles for different things?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because if I'm working on it, I'm using the 2x4 ones. If I'm just piling stuff on it, I'll use the plastic ones. I'll put a door across it or a piece of plywood and.
How about you, Rob? Do you have like your own welded sawhorses that?
No. It's funny. People ask me if I have like all my homemade stuff like that, but I try to limit my metalworking stuff to fun projects, not to just like utilitarian stuff. But
wait a minute, you don't think making sawhorses is fun?
If I didn't have so many other if I didn't have to come and do my day job, I would be perfectly fine building things like sawhorses.
Although you do have metal sawhorses.
Yeah. So when I was a carpenter, I think I mostly had pairs of those really flimsy galvanized sheet metal ones, and it's because they were lightweight. And that's the thing is when you're working on job sites and you have a small vehicle, you want something you can just toss in the back and go, especially if you're on small projects where you're not there for, long periods of time. So it's sort of like, how big is the project? How often do I have to move these things? The ones I've sort of moved to more recently are these heavy steel ones with these really thin sort of C-channel legs that have little extensions that you can pop in with wing nuts. And both styles, I keep a 2x4 screwed to the top as a sacrificial surface for like cutting sheet goods. They didn't have all the fancy new types of sawhorses when I bought any of these years ago yet, or if they did, they were too expensive for me. And so I've thought about buying some of the sort of more modern fancy styles with nicer legs and more adjustability. But it just, since I'm stationary now and I have a workshop, I've got a couple of old 2x4 ones lying around for projects in my barn, and anything that I'm working on out in the yard, I use those steel ones.
I have a couple sets. One I made as part of a building skills, which was a department we had, meant to be for newbies. And they're the legs are cut from a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. And then the top is just a 2x6 with a pair of grooves on each end that the plywood with a U-shaped cutout slips into. And I love those because they take up almost no space, but they have the drawbacks. They don't stand on uneven ground. I have the one you were talking about, Rob, that have the folding legs with the extensions. Those seem to want to cut my fingers off every time I open them. Mm-hmm. The lighter gauge ones that you've talked about similarly seem to want to open an artery every time you use them. So I'll be interested what folks come up with. The one I've really been dreaming about are the made by Trojan, which is a U.S. company, and they are just legs and they clamp on to whatever piece of stock you want to use, whether it's 2x4, 2x6, 2x8. And they're very small, but they're kind of heavy and expensive. I think they're like $80 a pop. So,
There's a couple in the office in a box Matt ordered for some purpose. Do you guys know what those are?
I got to go over there and check those out. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they're still in our office.
Well, and we did get some feedback from some people, and certain people have their favorite styles for sure, but some people are just like, whatever scraps lying around on the job site, and it stays on the job site. It's like it's easy to throw together something that works out of stuff you have drops from your framing lumber or whatever, so there's definitely something to be said about having some homemade cheap ones. I mean, you read articles from the magazine from years ago, and it was like, back in the day, it was pretty much the first thing that a new carpenter would do on a job site as a builder would be build a set of sawhorses out of whatever wood they had lying around. And it was sort of a test.
It seems like a good test, right? If you can do this with some competency in a reasonable amount of time, someone can measure, they can cut, that they have some design sense, whatever it is. So, it seems like a good gauge of someone's competency quickly.
So the next time somebody comes to do some work at my house, I should have them put together some sawhorses first. part of the bid.
Yeah. And I think you just have a bunch of random crap and you ask them to do this and see how they do.
Right. Can you do something with that? That's funny.
Well, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you all today.
You too.
Likewise.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Kiley, Rob, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Happy building, and thanks very much for listening.